This isn't just land. It's not just soil, trees, or a boundary on a surveyor's map. This land has memory. For over 200 years, it has absorbed the sweat of my ancestors, the prayers whispered into the wind, the laughter of children who ran barefoot through tall grass, and the tears of those who stood here in moments of loss and hope alike. Every stone, every fence post, every weathered tree holds a story. And now they want to take it. Not with bulldozers, not with soldiers, but with paper, pressure, and silence. They call it annexation. I call it erasure.
At sunrise, the land looks the same as it always has. Golden light spills across fields that were cleared by hands long gone. The old oak near the western edge still leans slightly east, scarred by a lightning strike decades ago. The farmhouse still creaks in the same places when the wind shifts. If you didn't know what was coming, you'd think this place was timeless. But then there's the letter. White envelope, official seal, language polished to sound reasonable. A cease and desist, a notice of intent. Words chosen carefully, like a blade wrapped in silk. This is not an admission of wrongdoing, it says. This correspondence is a courtesy, it claims. But buried beneath the legal language is a threat. Comply. Stay quiet, or we will make this painful. This land has been in our family since before there were paved roads here, before zoning boards, before homeowners associations existed as corporate entities with lawyers on retainer. My great-great-grandfather worked this soil with his hands. No machines, no shortcuts, just endurance. When he passed, the land didn't change hands, it changed hearts. Each generation added something without taking away its soul. A barn, a well, a fence built not to divide, but to protect. We didn't just own this land, we belonged to it. And then the neighborhood grew. At first, they were friendly. Smiles at the edge of the property line, conversations about community, invitations to meetings we didn't attend because, why would we? We weren't part of their HOA. We never wanted to be. But friendliness has a way of changing once someone realizes they can't control you. The emails started next. Just a formality, nothing to worry about. Then came the meetings we were suddenly expected to attend. Then the tone shifted. Firm, cold, legal. That's when we realized this wasn't about community. It was about power and silence.
The HOA's playbook, how annexation works and why it's dangerous. Homeowners associations don't usually start with lawsuits. They start with normalization. They talk about uniformity. They talk about property values. They talk about the greater good. But what they're really doing is building a narrative, one where resistance looks unreasonable, one where dissent becomes disruption. Annexation is the final step in that narrative. They claim it's procedural, technical, routine, but nothing about it is harmless. First, they explore zoning changes, quietly, through committees most people never attend. Then they float ideas like shared infrastructure or mutual access. Then come the documents, old maps, selective interpretations of easements, claims that boundaries were never clearly defined. And then the legal intimidation begins. Emails escalate, deadlines appear. You're warned that challenging them will be expensive, that fighting will only make things worse. This is where SLAP lawsuits enter the picture. Strategic lawsuits against public participation. They aren't designed to win. They're designed to exhaust, to drain your finances, to scare you into compliance, to make speaking out feel dangerous. We saw it coming when they started referencing defamation in conversations that had nothing to do with reputation, when they warned us about public statements, when they asked us to stop raising concerns. They weren't just after the land, they were after our voice. And if they could silence us, they could silence anyone.
The first meeting with our legal team was sobering. Not because the case was weak, but because it was heavy. Property law is complex by design. It's layered with precedent, exceptions, and interpretations that favor those with deeper pockets. The HOA had resources. They had lawyers who specialized in intimidation. We had truth and history and a willingness to fight. Our legal strategy wasn't just defensive, it was exposure. If they wanted to threaten us into silence, we would make noise. We documented everything: emails, letters, meeting recordings. We established timelines that showed how friendly discussions became coercive pressure. And we prepared for the possibility of a SLAP suit by building a defense before it even arrived. But strategy doesn't eliminate stress. Every legal filing costs money. Every delay costs sleep. There were nights when the weight felt unbearable. One night stands out. I was standing near the old oak, phone in hand, rereading an email that suggested we reconsider our position for the sake of harmony. Harmony, as if surrender is peace. I remember thinking, if I give in now, what am I handing to the next generation? Silence or strength? That night, we decided something. No matter how this ends, we would not disappear quietly.
Beyond the courtroom, community, media, and the future. Something unexpected happened once we spoke out. People listened. Neighbors we barely knew reached out with their own stories. Landowners who had been pressured into annexation shared regrets they'd never voiced publicly. Journalists started asking questions, and suddenly the narrative shifted. The HOA didn't like attention, because attention breaks intimidation. Social media became our shield. Every post documented facts. Every video explained process. No exaggeration, no drama, just truth. The more transparent we were, the weaker their threats became. Because SLAP tactics thrive in darkness. Public scrutiny is their enemy. Community support grew, not just emotionally, but strategically. We learned about anti-SLAP statutes. We connected with advocacy groups. We realized this fight was bigger than us. This wasn't just about land. It was about the right to speak without fear, to question authority without retaliation, to exist outside a system that demands conformity. The moment the HOA realized we would not quietly fold, the pressure changed. It was no longer procedural, it was personal. Letters began arriving more frequently, not just from attorneys, but from departments we had never interacted with before. Code compliance, environmental review, property assessment. Each letter alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Suddenly, structures that had stood for decades were being questioned. A shed my grandfather built was now potentially non-compliant. A fence line that had never been disputed was now under review. They were searching for leverage, not because they believed they were right, but because they believed exhaustion would do what intimidation could not. Phone calls came next. Not threatening, just persistent. Voicemails that spoke slowly, carefully, reminding us how long legal disputes can last, how expensive they can become, how unpredictable outcomes can be. The message was always the same, even when the words changed. You can stop this anytime.
But stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant something far worse than losing land. It meant rewriting our history without our consent. The silent cost of fighting back. People often think legal battles are loud. They imagine courtroom drama, raised voices, slamming gavels, but most of it happens in silence. It happens at kitchen tables late at night, papers spread out under dim lights. It happens when you open your email and hesitate before reading the next message. It happens when you calculate expenses and realize this month's legal bill is larger than last year's repairs on the house. There were conversations we never thought we would have, about how long we could afford to fight, about what we would do if things went badly, about whether protecting land was worth the strain it placed on relationships. The hardest part wasn't fear, it was doubt. Not doubt about the land, doubt about endurance. Because slap-style pressure isn't meant to defeat you in court, it's meant to fracture you at home.
A discovery that changed everything. Halfway through the process, something unexpected surfaced. While reviewing archived zoning records, our legal team noticed inconsistencies. Documents that referenced future developments before they were publicly announced. Meeting minutes that suggested decisions were made before votes occurred. It wasn't illegal on its face, but it was revealing. The annexation attempt wasn't spontaneous. It was planned years ago. Our land wasn't an obstacle. It was a target. Once that realization set in, everything clicked. The friendliness, the sudden urgency, the escalation. They weren't reacting to resistance. They were reacting to exposure. And exposure is dangerous to institutions that operate on quiet compliance. The moment the narrative shifted. There is a moment in every long fight when momentum changes. You don't always recognize it immediately. For us, it happened during a routine hearing. Nothing dramatic, no speeches. Just a simple question asked by someone who wasn't convinced by rehearsed answers. Why now? Why this land? Why this family? The room went quiet, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was uncomfortable. From that moment on, the HOA's language changed again. They stopped framing annexation as inevitable. They started framing it as negotiable. But negotiation assumes equal footing, and we were no longer interested in compromises built on coercion. Generations speak without words. One afternoon, we walked the property together, not to inspect, not to document, just to remember. We stood near the well that no longer draws water, but still marks where survival once depended on it. We traced initials carved into wood long before any of us were born. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. Legacy isn't something you explain. It's something you feel pressing against your chest when the possibility of loss becomes real. In that silence, the decision was made again. Not out of anger, out of responsibility.
The long middle of the battle. Legal conflicts don't end quickly. They stretch. Months turn into seasons. Seasons turn into years. There were periods when nothing seemed to happen at all. No filings, no hearings, just waiting. Waiting is part of the pressure, because life doesn't pause while disputes drag on. Bills still arrive. People still age. Time keeps moving forward, indifferent to injustice. And yet, the land remained unchanged, still quiet, still steady, still holding the weight of everything unfolding above it. That contrast became grounding. No matter how chaotic the process became, the land didn't ask us to rush. It asked us to stay. A reckoning without resolution. Eventually, the annexation effort slowed. Not stopped, not resolved, just stalled. Whether due to scrutiny, internal disagreement, or fear of precedent, the momentum they once had dissipated. But they never admitted wrongdoing. Institutions rarely do. Instead, they reframed, they repositioned, they waited. And so did we. Because some fights aren't meant to end cleanly. Some are meant to be endured.
The evidence no one was supposed to see. The breakthrough did not come from the courtroom. It came quietly, unexpectedly. Late one evening, an email arrived from an address we didn't recognize. No subject line, no explanation, just files. Hundreds of them. Financial statements, internal emails, board meeting recordings, vendor invoices, private memos never meant to leave closed doors. At first, we assumed it was a mistake. Then we started reading. What emerged wasn't just evidence of misconduct, it was evidence of rot. An insider, someone who had watched the machine operate from within, had finally decided they couldn't carry the weight anymore. They never asked for recognition. They never asked for protection. They only wrote one sentence. They are lying to everyone, including themselves. The hidden engine behind the annexation. The documents revealed something far more dangerous than an aggressive HOA. They revealed motive. Annexation wasn't about community planning. It was about money. Private development kickbacks hidden through shell vendors, inflated maintenance contracts routed to relatives of board members, reserve funds quietly siphoned into consulting fees that never produced anything. The land wasn't just valuable for expansion, it was collateral. Absorbing it would justify new assessments, new bonds, new fees, and those fees would disappear the same way the others had. What we were facing was no longer a property dispute. It was financial fraud disguised as governance. And once that truth surfaced, everything accelerated. The collapse begins. When our legal team reviewed the files, the room went silent. Not because they were unsure, but because they understood the scale. This was no longer a civil defense. This was exposure. The evidence was independently verified, then quietly forwarded. Auditors were notified, regulators were alerted, and suddenly the HOA's attorneys stopped calling. Meetings were postponed, statements were revised, then deleted. Board members began resigning, not publicly, but abruptly, one by one. What had once felt like an unstoppable institution began fracturing under its own weight, because corruption survives on secrecy, and secrecy had vanished overnight. Chaos behind closed doors. While the outside world still saw manicured lawns and polite notices, inside the HOA, panic spread. Emergency sessions were called without minutes, accounts were frozen, insurance providers withdrew coverage, banks demanded explanations, vendors stopped answering calls, and when the first formal investigation was announced, everything unraveled at once. Finger-pointing replaced unity, emails contradicted sworn statements, years of routine decisions were suddenly impossible to justify. The annexation effort wasn't withdrawn, it was abandoned. Not because they chose to stop, but because they no longer had the authority or credibility to continue.
The day it ended. There was no dramatic verdict, no triumphant speech, just a filing, a simple notice stating that all annexation actions against our land were terminated, effective immediately. No appeal, no conditions, no explanation. Shortly after, the HOA itself entered receivership. Accounts were seized, assets audited, leadership dissolved. What had once threatened to erase generations collapsed under the weight of its own deception. And just like that, the pressure was gone. Standing on the land after the storm. The first morning after it ended felt unreal. No emails, no letters, no deadlines. Just wind moving through trees that had stood long before any of this began. We walked the land again, not in defiance, not in fear, but in quiet recognition. It hadn't been saved by force. It had been saved by truth arriving at exactly the moment it was needed. Someone inside had chosen conscience over complicity, and that choice changed everything. Legacy finally secured. The land remains ours, legally, historically, morally. But more than that, the record now exists. What was attempted, how it was done, and why it failed. Future developers will see it, future boards will remember it, and future generations will inherit not just acreage, but proof. Proof that power can be challenged, proof that silence is not inevitable, proof that even systems built to intimidate can collapse when exposed. As the sun sets over the fields, the land holds its ground. So do we. Not because we were louder, not because we were richer, but because, in the end, truth outlasted control.